Good evening. It's good to see each and every one of you that chose to be here for our midweek Bible study. You are in the auditorium class, and I'm glad to see each and every one of you. If you do happen to be tuning in virtually, thank you for being with us in that capacity. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. We've been in a series of lessons for a few weeks now, looking at the subject or the theme of heaven and hell, the eternal abode of the soul, the long home that we are all destined to, one or the other. And so we've been looking predominantly at heaven over the last several weeks. And as I mentioned last time, part of what we're looking at now was requested. Someone asked, can you deal with the subject of what they termed, and you may have heard termed before, and the way I present it, this varying degrees of reward and also varying degrees of punishment. And so, will it be the same, or are there discrepancies in the experience that we might have? And so we've been dealing with that. I went through the slides I'm going to go over now rather quickly so I could kind of present it, but we didn't look at it in much depth at all last time, if you recall. So we'll review a little bit and pick up where we left off. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, there's this reminder that we will face some scrutiny of what we did while we are here to determine our reward. And so we noted that, and I think it's worth reading again. If you happen to have your Bible and want to follow along, that might be helpful. But this scene in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, it talks about how in verse 13 that the day will declare it. We might think about 2 Timothy chapter 4, starting around verse 6, where Paul was ultimately going to receive his reward, that crown of righteousness, on that day. And so that would be an event following the Lord's return when we have the resurrection and the judgment, and then we have our eternal destiny awarded to us, either heaven or hell. But he's describing as part of that a scrutiny of our works. He describes a foundation, and then he describes how each one's works are going to be rewarded. Look at verse 5 of chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians. It describes Paul and Apollos as servants or ministers through whom others believed. And then he describes the process in verse 6 where I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. And he describes this process later in chapter 3, starting around verse 12, that there's this foundation that's laid by Jesus and the apostles, Jesus being that chief cornerstone, and then we build on it, and then that work is tested as with fire, and if it's built on a wrong foundation, it'll be destroyed, but it won't equate to the destruction of your soul. You'll still have your salvation, as described here later in chapter 3. But he's describing how each one will receive their reward based upon their labor. Jesus goes out of the way to say, even a cup of water given in my name will warrant a reward. Now that's an act or action that someone can choose to do, their own labor. We looked at 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10 last time. Will somebody read that for us ever so quickly? 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10.
For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, according to that he has done, whether it be good or bad.
That everyone may receive the fruits or what they've done while they were in their body. Now, is that the same for everybody? Well, obviously not. And the point that I made last week is, I don't think anyone would say that the Apostle Paul, for example, and myself are going to receive the same reward or the same treasures that we've stored up in heaven. Store up for yourself treasures. And this is what we talked about last week. And we got to this point right here, and then the bell came. The reason I think that this question was posed to me, and I know for a fact that the reason this question was posed to me in the past, was concern. Now, suppose I get to heaven only to realize I could have done more and thus had more reward in heaven. Wouldn't I suffer regret? Or they would say, how am I going to feel if my neighbor in heaven is recognized or has more, quote, treasures in heaven or different rewards that are recognized? Again, recognized to the glory of God. But wouldn't that cause covetousness or envy? My response is usually, well, then I don't think you're describing heaven. And then we mentioned this verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 26 where it says, and I'll give you a loose paraphrase, if one individual or member of this body, as it's illustrated for us in 1 Corinthians 12, is honored, then the other members of that body rejoice and are glad. I don't think that it would cause envy or covetousness because those things are not part of what's permissible in heaven. Those things would be outside of that. Now, I think it's important to note what we are not referring to or what I don't mean. If you've ever studied the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, they have an unorthodox description or doctrine that surrounds heaven. You'll recall when we studied the book of Revelation, we noted the 144,000 and how the Jehovah's Witness will often equate these to actual literal numeric group of people who are in a certain portion of heaven, tier of heaven, if you will. And then there are, depending upon who you talk to, there are a number of different tiers, I guess, or levels within heaven. There's the most elite, and then there's the ones kind of in the middle, and there's the ones that are, I'm not trying to be funny, but they're in heaven, but kind of just this side of not heaven, they kind of barely made it. They're at the bottom level kind of thing. If you've ever looked at purchasing a condo at the beach, I don't know if you've ever entertained that, but hey, look, everybody can daydream. I not can afford them, but I am curious what they cost, or was at one point in my life, and so I looked, and I don't know if you know this, but as they go up, they charge you more. And the ones at the very top are, the penthouse type level, and they're even more expensive. Well, that's the idea that they have, that there's like a tier system, and the 144,000, they're up here, and then the rest of them are relegated to lower level. That is not what I mean at all. We're all going to be in heaven, but we won't all have the same experience. Can you imagine if... Okay, let me ask this. If you are encountering people in heaven to whom you directly were someone who studied with them, like we have here in 1 Corinthians 3, where you labored to become ministers through whom others believe, and someone's in heaven because of your effort, won't that make heaven the sweeter? Yeah. Now we'll talk about the converse of that in just a second. That's the gist of what we're saying, and it's been illustrated different ways before. One way I heard it illustrated was, and it related to me because I like golf. I'm not real good at it, but I like it. And the idea is that me and Tiger Woods could go to the most beautiful, perfect golf course, and we would both be at the same place. But I think he would have a little bit different experience and appreciation given what he knew and what he understood and his experience and knowledge and intimacy with the sport. And I don't know if that's helpful, if that's a good way to illustrate it, but we'd be at the same place, but we'd have different experiences. You imagine the fellow that obeyed the gospel and died the next day, knowing very little about the Bible, would have the same appreciation as someone who obeyed the gospel and lived faithfully and served and grew in their knowledge and understanding and had a great sense of appreciation and leaned on their faith, incidentally, through trials and struggles and hardships and made it to the end and had 60 years of serving the Lord, versus the fellow who, obeyed the gospel and died the next day. Would they have the same experience in heaven? Well, no, not necessarily, because don't you take your memories with you? I mean, you'd be in the same place, but would it be the same experience.
So how does that tie in then with the man who hired the laborers and the one at the end got the very same reward as the one at the beginning because it was the masters to give out?
Sure. Yeah, in Matthew chapter 20, there's the parable of the man who hires people throughout the day, and at the end of the day, he paid them in reverse order, and the other ones thought, well, we're going to get something better. And the point of that is that they ultimately receive the same place. That's the illustration I just used. If someone obeyed the gospel this very night, knowing, the basics to become a Christian, and they died, where are they going to go? Heaven. Well, where did the Apostle Paul go when he died? Heaven. And again, we're talking about we've mentioned the particulars, the intermediate state. I'm not going all over those particulars again. But yes, they'd be in the same place. But there was a discrepancy of experiences, reward, knowledge, understanding, occasions to appeal to and appreciate for all eternity with every memory. With every individual that we influence. How many people will end up in heaven because of the ministry of the Apostle Paul? Could you venture? I couldn't even venture a guess. And wouldn't that be different from the fellow who obeyed the gospel and, dropped dead the next day? They'd be in the same place, but there would be this, for lack of a better phrase, degree of reward that was different. Yeah, the argument is, I think about 1 Timothy chapter 1 where he said, starting around verse 12, that he was a pattern for those who would believe after him. And so he served as a perpetual pattern. A grand percentage of the New Testament can be attributed to the chosen vessel of Paul.
Well, why should you care about what reward you're going to get knowing you're going to heaven anyway?
Well, sure. Well, that's like saying, well, I'm going to go to heaven. Why would I want to take anybody with me? Wouldn't we? When we talk about treasures, we're not talking about like I get to heaven and I've got a big screen TV and you don't. That's not. That's obviously not what we're describing. We're not describing material things. We're just talking about a legacy, an influence, a life, good works, things that glorified God, things that ultimately could lead to someone else's remaining faithful or becoming a Christian. That's the immediate context of 1 Corinthians 3. What's interesting is much more is said about degrees of punishment in hell than is said about degrees of reward in heaven. We'll get there. Other questions or comments before we do? Well, sure. Well, I think that was Gert's point. I'd be glad to be there, if I just am there, but I don't. Yeah.
I don't know, how do I reconcile degrees of reward with being told that it's the same?
Well,
you're just saying that I wish to give to the last man the same as to you.
Yeah. If we look,
You just mean the general reward, but not the specific.
when we think about the parable, what is the parable teaching us?
That no one's greater because they found Jesus first.
Oh, yeah, and I agree. I think everything that we bring from the parable in terms of those principles doesn't contradict or fly in the face of this notion that the experience that we have in this life, the things that we do, are not all like back to zero and don't have any bearing upon our eternal experience. In other words, Paul, I think, is the greatest example that I can think of. We could probably talk about other people. But his experience in eternity is at least in some way shaped by the life and legacy that he lived. Does that make sense? Now, if again, I'm not advocating for some notion that there are tiers or that you're like, well, I didn't do as much as Paul, so I'm not going to be happy. Well, no, it's a place that in his presence is the fullness of joy. And there's perfect peace in his presence. That's why I spent all that time talking about the place. That's the place we go. But we also take with us our works. I mean, didn't we read about half a dozen verses about that? Well, are we all taking the same works? No. So that's part of our reward in heaven. That's all I'm advocating for. Not to suggest we'll be in different tiers or different places, or someone will be dissatisfied or discontent because the Apostle Paul, more people got there because of the Apostle Paul than me, so I don't want to be here anymore. No, I'm not suggesting that at all. All right, other questions?
I guess I was going to say that it's more of a comment. It's hard to imagine that Jesus says, in my Father's house there are many rooms. Some of them are 3-star, some of them are 4-star. I mean,
No, there's
no.
no.
Go into that detail because there's probably no difference in that regard. But the experience could be different. I understand that to be the case, but there isn't a description. The Bible doesn't go out of the way to describe that there are different degrees or comfort things, kind of like what you said. You've gone over heaven's heaven.
Yeah. Look, the word degree of reward isn't found in the Bible, but if you know a better way to say it, I'll say it a better way. But this is the way it's posed to me as a question. Is there a difference? Well, yes. I mean, obviously, and again, I don't know how else to say it, but looking at the Apostle Paul and his eternal destiny, we can be in the same place. But does he go absent of his memory, experience, and influence, or with it? With it, and so do we. That's all I'm saying.
Since I'm relatively new as a Christian, I've tried to spend most of my life doing good and doing the right things, but I wasn't a Christian. Will that not count at all?
Oh, no, I'm not suggesting that.
I'm confused.
Which part are you confused about? Because you're...
Almost everything I'm saying. I'm sorry, Joel.
No, there's nothing to be sorry for. I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that there is some kind of deficiency in heaven based upon the extent of your influence or works. All I'm suggesting is you take them with you, and I'm only suggesting that because that's what the Scriptures say. Do I understand and appreciate what that looks like? What does it look like to have the fruit of your influence eternally? I don't know. I mean, it's not like a trophy you put on a shelf. It's not an extra, thing you get in your room in heaven, so to speak. Again, we're trying to quantify the spiritual. But I am saying that the Bible goes out of the way on numerous occasions to say the things that you do are noted by the Lord, and the Lord is a record keeper, and that record follows you eternally. And everybody's going to have a different record. That's all.
But I guess my question is does anything that it count in my favor before I became a Christian?
Well, let me be very clear and explain it this way. I'm not suggesting that our good works are the means or method with which we arrive in heaven. We come to heaven by grace. We're not meriting. It's not as if I'm saying, okay, I need to store up enough of these good works that He'll let me in. The way that anyone is allowed entrance into the fellowship and communion with God is through the blood of His Son, our faith in the gospel, and how we respond in obedience to that. As far as to, I don't have the key to unpack how these works will stand in this scene of 1 Corinthians 3. In other words, you say, okay, well, I did this. Is that going to be something I'll receive a reward for? on the foundation of Christ? Is it something that will withstand this scrutiny that's described in 1 Corinthians 3? That's not anything I can work out all the particulars of or know exactly the experience that it'll be in the eternal. But I do know our works follow us. What does that look like? I don't know precisely. But it's not meant to demotivate us. It's meant to motivate us.
Was it not Cornelius, the first non-Jew to enter into the church to be baptized?
Mm-hmm.
And it said that his works and the things that he did came up as a memorial to God, and that's why I'm going to assume he was given the opportunity to be the first Gentile to come into the fold.
Sure, Cornelius was a man of good reputation and good deeds. He gave alms. He had prayers, and these were received by the Lord. So we could note that those were prior to him obeying the gospel. But again, it's not a means to degrade being in heaven by suggesting that not everyone has equal influence that they bring with them or works that they did. Either they're recognized or they're not. And I certainly feel, even just in a sample, we've noted enough scripture that they do indeed follow us. They do indeed matter. They do indeed make a difference. I mean, you got to think about some of these gospel preachers from years past who, they would tout, I'm not going to name names. They'd say, well, this brother's baptized over 1,000 people. And it would be written on the back of his book, and it would be part of his introduction, incidentally, if he came to preach a gospel meeting. So-and-so's with us, brother so-and-so. He's baptized over 1,000 people. Does that matter or not? Are those people going to heaven? Is that something that, would it be a different experience if you bumped into people perpetually that were there because you were a minister through whom they believed, like Paul or Apollos? Would that make a difference? Yes. That's all. All right, let's move on a tab, because undeniably, the Bible speaks to this subject too as it pertains to punishment and hell. That hell is not the same for everybody. Just like heaven's not the same for everybody. You're in the same place. Okay, what's interesting is we spent several weeks talking about heaven, and then we dealt with this issue of the varying rewards or differing rewards. But we haven't even started talking about hell. So I wanted to ever so quickly give kind of a summary. Should be elementary. Some of this stuff we'll unpack as we transition from talking about heaven to hell. But I want to go over it quickly before I talk about this degrees of punishment. It's described as a place of darkness where you'll be cast into outer darkness. What's interesting about one of the plagues, as you might recall from the plagues of Egypt, one of those plagues was darkness. And that darkness is described as being felt. That's interesting. Somebody want to read that for us, Exodus 10 and verse 21? Darkness over the whole land, even darkness which may be felt. How do you feel darkness? Well, maybe darkness creates a feeling. It does for children. It does when electricity goes out, or it does when you walk down an alley in a city you've never been to, maybe, right? And so the idea is that it's a darkness that's associated with, some anxiety maybe. It's described as a place of pain. Yes, sir.
While you're on the topic of darkness, this is multiple days.
Oh, sure.
Of darkness, and it says they really didn't go out. They didn't go anywhere because they didn't have artificial light quite so much and prevalent as we have. They just go to bed when it's dark.
Yeah, it was crippling and debilitating. And
you're
yeah,
waiting for the sun to come up, and it isn't going to come up
yeah.
in hell.
Yeah, in hell there's no hope, right? In other words, it wouldn't be hell if you could get a calendar and start putting X's on it and say, well, you know, I got a 10,000 year sentence and I've done 1 year, you know, I've done 2 years, I'm getting closer and I'm getting closer and I'm getting closer. It wouldn't be hell because it's a place with no hope, right? What's interesting enough is we'll talk in some point, not the next week or in the subsequent weeks, about how it's described so often as a fire. And people have asked me before, well, how can it be described as a fire and be dark? Maybe if that's the question, we're thinking too literal, but we'll talk about that. But it's described as a place of pain, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's described as a place of torment. It's described as a place without rest. In the book of Hebrews, there's this reminder of being able to come to a place of rest and that hope to enter still remains. And so here's this description of heaven that we've noted as a place of rest, resting from your labors. But in Revelation 14 and verse 11, there's no rest. No rest. It's a place of separation. We see this described on several occasions, and I'm going through this kind of quickly on purpose. I just want to set our mind right, because we spent several weeks talking about heaven, and heaven is the place, but then we talked about these, I don't know, discrepancies or different experiences or different treasures, if you will. So I just wanted to paint a little bit of a picture, but we'll talk about some of these verses more when we get to them. In Revelation chapter 22, it describes heaven as a great city, a city whose builder and maker is God, or this new Jerusalem, or heavenly Jerusalem. And then it describes all those that are not part of the city as being outside, or expelled, or banished. And we see several allusions to this, that they were cast out, or expelled, or banished. We also see that this is hell, is described as a place of the wrath of God being exercised or experienced. We've mentioned this before, but in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 9, it talks about the wrath of God being poured out, and it's being poured out in full strength or without mixture. This perpetual justice towards sin that we might call the wrath of God. Now, we've been saved from that. Romans chapter 5 and verse 9. We're saved from the wrath through what Jesus accomplished. But that wrath, that it is just for Him to execute on sin, well, we either accept that it was done on the cross, or it has to be accomplished in hell. And that's how it's described, a place of God's perpetual judgment, punishment. And the thing to mention that I think is noteworthy, and we may mention this again when we talk about the doctrine of annihilation, where some will suggest that there is no hell, that you just cease to exist, and that there's a resurrection, but it's just for the just, and that people that don't get to go, quote, to heaven, they just don't exist. They're annihilated. But no, the Bible's clear to say that the punishment, the place where you'll be if you're in hell, is eternal. It's not just, well, I just reject God and then I will just die and I won't have any more consciousness and it'll be like I'll never existed. No. If you reject God and die, you spend a place in the place of consciousness eternally. And we see several descriptions of that, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay, now, we're going to talk about hell for the next at least couple of weeks. I just really wanted to give that kind of snippet before we looked at the other side of this coin, where we talked about, I don't know, if you will, degrees of reward. Now we talk about degrees of punishment. Let's go over to the book of Hebrews. Look at Hebrews chapter 10. Read with me a couple of verses there. We'll start in verse 26. Hebrews chapter 10. It says, "For if we sin willfully after we receive the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sin, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment and fiery indignation, which will devour the adversaries. Anyone who has rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." Listen to this phrase of verse 29. "How much worse punishment do you suppose will be thought worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, counted the blood of the covenant which he was sanctified a common thing, and insulted the Spirit of grace. For we know him who says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And so he equates this notion of sinning willfully after. See, when I look at this, I ask the question, well, why would the punishment be worse? Okay, put a pin in that. Go over to 2 Peter chapter 2. Why would the punishment be worse? Look at 2 Peter chapter 2. Read with me just a couple of verses here. We'll look at verse 20 and 21. For if, after they'd escaped the pollution of the world, through the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and overcome, the latter end is worse for them than the beginning. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than to have known it and turned from the holy commandments delivered to them. Why would it be worse? Because they knew. And that's precisely what's said in Hebrews chapter 10. For if we sin willfully after we have the knowledge of the truth. And so here is this description saying it would have been better if they'd have never known and then left. What's the opposite of better? Worse. And so here's this caution that why is that important in eternity? Well, I don't know. I guess you're still going to know it. Does that make sense? All right. I think Rod had his hand up first.
It's like, first degree murder, second degree murder.
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Well, people did, murdered someone. One was deliberate, the other one may have been an accident or something. But
Right.
the result was the same. Someone died, but one was deliberate manslaughter.
Yeah. The analogy helps, but it breaks down. Here's how it helps and here's how it breaks down. The analogy is two guys commit murder. One, the circumstances lend itself to first degree murder. The other lend itself to manslaughter. Okay? Two crimes. Guess where they both go? Jail. But the idea is, well, they don't both carry out the same sentence because their crime varies. But where it breaks down is there is no leniency in hell. There is no, well, this guy's just serving manslaughter. This guy's serving first degree. So that's where it breaks down. However, hold the thought just a second. Here's what, and we're going to run out of time, and I don't want to be misheard. Here's what I'm not describing. If you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he is an Italian poet. And he wrote the Divine Comedy, and he also wrote in this section, the Inferno. And he describes 9 levels that are circular as he goes down and descends of varying degrees of hell. That is not what I'm advocating for. I'm not advocating for that at all, any more than I'm advocating for there's a tier system in heaven, and like the Jehovah's Witness suggests that, I'm in heaven A, you're in heaven B, you're in heaven C, and you're in heaven D, you barely made it. No, I'm not advocating for that. And I'm not advocating for Dante's various levels of hell, because what's interesting is the first level is called limbo, and that level is where there's like not real bad people. They were good people, but they were never obedient to the gospel. He even mentions they were never baptized, and so they get to stay in this first level, and it's not really bad. No, hell is really, really bad. I don't want anyone to say, well, he just talked, if you're not a real bad person, you go to a hell that's not real bad. No, I never say that. Or I don't ever leave here and say, well, Joseph, you won't go to a really good heaven if you don't have a lot of works with you. No, I never said that. Y'all with me? So we're not talking about Dante's levels of hell here. What we're talking about is different experiences. Oh, yes, you will experience the same torment and tragedy of hell, just like you'll experience the same joy of heaven. But if you sat there your whole life, and you heard gospel preaching your whole life, and you white-knuckled the pew and you never came forward, are you going to have the same experience? as someone who didn't have all of those occasions that you can remember forever? Remember your mama begging you to sit down and study the Bible? You remember that preacher begging you to do this? But you didn't do any of it. And you'll remember that. I got my chances. I didn't do anything with it. I was an idiot. That's going to be with you for eternity. Does that make sense? That's why Hitler will have a different experience than the fellow, your neighbor who just, is a decent person, but, won't never come around to obeying the gospel. They'll both be in the same place, but they'll have a different myriad of experiences and memories. All right, there were a couple of hands, and we had our first bell. I think it was Miss Brenda.
Well, what I'm hearing is that what we do, whether it's good or bad, really does matter.
Amen.
Because I think that sometimes we feel like, oh, it was just a card I sent.
Right.
It really didn't make a difference. But I think that when we get to heaven and we see those encouraging words or that good deed that was done, we'll get to see the final outcome and how long-reaching, like what Ben was saying about Paul.
Yeah.
There's no way Paul could have known how far-reaching what he was doing mattered.
His influence by these good works.
And the results of what he did, even if it was something insignificant. But the same way with punishment. Oh, listen, I just stole somebody's car, but I don't realize what the full outcome of that was. I stole their car, but then that guy lost his job, and then he did something else. And you'll see the full scope
Right.
of what you did matter.
That's a great way to illustrate it. How many, and I hate to use the word little, but how many little things have you done that may have impacted and ultimately determined someone's eternal destiny, whether they were good or bad? In other words, it could have been you said, I'm going to use your words, a card. It could have been a card or an encouragement or a phone call or a visit at the right time meant the difference of somebody quitting the church or not, right? It could have been that you did that one thing that was, how many times somebody said, well, I left the church because somebody's mean to me. Now, should they have left the church because somebody's mean to them? No. No. But how do you know that the things that we do are not as seemingly insignificant as they are, that they can impact eternal destinies? All right. I think Ben had his hand up, and I think there's one more, and I'll let you get your comments in for the bell. Okay. Who else had a comment, question, or thought? What makes it worse? Because they're going to be in a different level? No. What makes it worse? Because they're going to be in a different place? No. Is there a better portion of hell? And be like, well, I'll be okay there. No. No. I'm not advocating for that. If we look at Luke chapter 20, look quickly as time permits. We'll read a couple of verses. Can I get a volunteer to read verse 45, 46, and 7 of Luke 20?
While all the people were listening, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who want to go around in long robes and who love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the places of honor, and they devour widows' houses and say long prayers just for show. These will receive harsher judgment.
Harsher judgment, or your translation might say greater condemnation. And here's what I always ask. Why? Why would their condemnation be any greater? Aren't they going to the same hell that the nice little old lady who just never would become a Christian, but she was a nice little old lady? Aren't they both going to hell? Y'all with me? Okay. So I don't want to send a nice little old lady to hell. Well, if she didn't obey the gospel, that's where she's destined. Okay. So the nice little old lady, and then, well, someone of completely. You make the most heinous crime you can think of. But the greater condemnation is based upon the memories, the experience, the understanding and appreciation for your crimes. You're not in some better level. You're at the same place. But if you have all of these occasions to appeal to where you were a scoundrel, you'll take those memories with you. That's all. That makes sense? All right, I think we're going to get really caught by the bell, but I'll mention this occasion in Luke 12, and we'll pick up here and talk some more about this. The occasion where it talks about a servant was beat with few stripes or many stripes. I don't know if you remember this, but what's the difference between the two? Why was one beaten with more stripes? A harsher punishment. Do you remember? Okay, well, let's go over there ever so quickly until the bell does ring. We should still be in Luke. Look at Luke chapter 12. Look at verse, I'm going to skip this. We'll have to pick up here next week. But it says, verse 47, and that servant who knew his master's will and did not prepare himself was the one that got many stripes. What's the difference? Knowledge. He knew. He knew more, and thus that burden became part of his punishment. And that's the burden of the punishment of anyone who's destined to hell. All right, we'll have to pick up here with some of these particulars and address any potential questions for this, Lord willing, next week.